you don't really think about it very much. Not least of all because the monarchy is about continuity. But I think for my brother...
December 9th, 2025. Princess Anne was conducting a routine inventory of her late mother's personal effects at Windsor Castle when she discovered something that would shatter the royal family forever. Hidden inside Queen Elizabeth's private safe were documents placed there by Camilla, documents that reveal secrets so explosive they threatened to destroy the monarchy itself. The safe that should have remained sealed. The discovery happened at 2:37 in the afternoon. Princess Anne had been working methodically through her mother's private apartments at Windsor Castle, a task she had been postponing for over 2 years since Elizabeth's death in September 2022. The pain of sorting through her mother's belongings had been too overwhelming, but duty demanded it be done. Anne was alone in the Queen's private study, a room that had been sealed since Elizabeth's final days. The space remained exactly as her mother had left it. Papers still on the desk, reading glasses folded beside an unfinished crossword puzzle, photographs of family arranged on every surface. The weight of absence was suffocating. The safe was built into the wall behind a portrait of King George VI, Elizabeth's beloved father. Anne had the combination, entrusted to her years ago as the most reliable and discreet of Elizabeth's children. The safe contained exactly what Anne expected. Important documents, family jewelry, private correspondence spanning decades. But as Anne carefully removed items, cataloging each piece, her hand touched something that should not have been there. A manila envelope unmarked, sealed with red wax bearing an impression Anne recognized immediately. It was Camilla's personal seal, the one she had used since becoming Duchess of Cornwall. Anne's blood ran cold. Why would Camilla have placed anything in the Queen's private safe? When would she have had access? And most troubling of all, what could she possibly want hidden here, in the most secure and private location in all the royal residences? The envelope was thick, heavy with contents that shifted as Anne lifted it. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, decades of royal training warring with a growing sense of dread about what she might find. Nothing good came from secrets this carefully hidden. Inside were documents, letters, photographs, bank statements, legal papers, each item more damning than the last. As Anne read, her face drained of color, her breathing became shallow, and the carefully maintained composure that defined her entire life began to crack. What Camilla had hidden in Elizabeth's safe was nothing less than evidence of systematic deception spanning over 30 years. Financial records showing payments made to silence potential scandals. Letters revealing manipulation and calculation behind what the public believed was a great love story. Photographs that contradicted official narratives about key moments in royal history. Anne read through page after page, each revelation more devastating than the last. Her mother's safe, the repository of Elizabeth's most precious and private possessions, had been violated by Camilla to hide evidence of actions that, if exposed, would destroy whatever remained of the monarchy's credibility. The most damaging documents appeared to be dated from the late 1980s and early 1990s, the period when Charles and Diana's marriage was collapsing and Charles's affair with Camilla was becoming increasingly difficult to hide. These papers revealed a level of premeditation and manipulation that contradicted every public statement made by Charles and Camilla about their relationship. There were bank statements showing large payments made to individuals who might have had damaging information. There were letters between Camilla and various media figures suggesting coordination in how certain stories were presented to the public. There were legal agreements, non-disclosure contracts signed by people whose names Anne recognized as former palace staff and associates of both Charles and Diana. But perhaps most shocking were personal letters written by Camilla herself, never intended for anyone else's eyes. These letters revealed her true feelings about Diana, about the royal family, about her own ambitions and calculations. They showed a woman far different from the devoted partner the public had been sold, someone who had manipulated circumstances and people with cold precision. Anne sank into her mother's desk chair, the documents spread before her, trying to process the magnitude of what she had discovered. Her mother had known. Elizabeth must have known, or at least suspected, which is why these documents had ended up in her safe. But how? When? And why had the Queen never acted on this information? The more immediate question was even more troubling. How had Camilla gained access to this safe to place these documents here? The combination was known only to Elizabeth and Anne herself. The safe had been checked after Elizabeth's death as part of securing the late Queen's effects. These documents had been placed here recently, sometime in the last 2 years, which meant Camilla had somehow obtained the combination to Elizabeth's most private safe. She had entered the sealed apartments, accessed the safe, and hidden evidence that could destroy her. But why hide it rather than destroy it? What possible reason could Camilla have for preserving documentation of her own deceptions? Anne's mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Was this insurance? Leverage against someone? A confession hidden away in case something happened to Camilla? Or was there something even more sinister at play, some scheme Anne could not yet see? Outside the study windows, Windsor Castle continued its daily operations. Tourists photographed the historic buildings. Guards maintained their posts. Staff went about their duties. None of them had any idea that inside the late Queen's private rooms, Princess Anne was holding documents that would change everything. Anne carefully photographed each page with her personal phone, creating a digital record before anything could happen to the originals. Years of dealing with palace intrigue had taught her that evidence could disappear, that accidents could be arranged, that powerful people would go to extraordinary lengths to protect themselves. As she worked, Anne's shock began transforming into something else. Anger. Deep, cold anger at the violation of her mother's private space. Fury at Camilla's audacity in using Elizabeth's safe for her own purposes. Rage at the lies that had been told, the manipulations that had occurred, the damage done to people and institution alike. Princess Anne had always been the dutiful one, the loyal daughter who put the monarchy above personal feelings. She had swallowed her disapproval of Charles and Camilla's relationship, had been civil when they married, had even been gracious when Camilla became queen consort. But this was different. This was unforgivable. The documents in her hands represented betrayal on multiple levels. Betrayal of Diana, who had been destroyed by forces more calculated than anyone realized. Betrayal of the institution, which had been manipulated to serve personal agendas. And most personally painful, betrayal of Elizabeth herself, whose safe and private space had been violated. Anne made a decision in that moment, sitting in her mother's chair surrounded by evidence of decades of deception. She would not hide this. She would not participate in another cover-up. Whatever the consequences for the monarchy, for her brother, for the family, the truth had to come out. Camilla's secret access. The question of how Camilla obtained access to Queen Elizabeth's safe became Anne's immediate priority. The combination was supposed to be known only to Elizabeth and Anne. The safe was in a sealed room, in private apartments that had been locked since the Queen's death. How had Camilla breached this security? Anne began her investigation by reviewing security logs for Windsor Castle, specifically access records for the private royal apartments. What she discovered was deeply troubling. On November 15, 2025, just 3 weeks ago, someone had entered the Queen's private quarters using an access code that should have been deactivated after Elizabeth's death. The entry was logged at 11:42 at night, a time when the castle was largely empty, most staff had gone home, and security presence was minimal. The person had been inside for 47 minutes, more than enough time to access the safe, place documents inside, and leave without detection. But the access code used did not identify who had entered. It was an administrative override, the type used by senior royals and their most trusted personal staff. This narrowed the possibilities but did not provide definitive proof. Anne needed more. She turned to the palace's head of security, a man who had served the royal family for over 30 years and whose loyalty was beyond question. In a private meeting, Anne presented what she had found and demanded answers about who could have accessed those rooms. The security chief was visibly shaken. The breach represented a massive failure in protecting the late Queen's private effects. He promised a full investigation, but admitted that if someone with sufficient authority wanted to access those rooms, they could do so with minimal oversight. The system was designed to trust senior royals and their representatives, not to suspect them of wrongdoing. Anne pushed harder. She wanted to know who had been at Windsor on November 15th. She wanted access to all security footage from that night. She wanted staff schedules, visitor logs, any piece of information that might identify who had violated her mother's private space. The investigation revealed something stunning. On November 15th, Camilla had been officially at Clarence House in London, but her personal protection officer's log showed a gap in coverage that night, several hours when Camilla's movements were unaccounted for. This was highly unusual. Senior royals are almost never without security presence, and any gap should have been immediately flagged. Anne pressed the protection officers for explanations. What she got was nervous evasion and vague references to private time that the Queen Consort had requested. When Anne demanded more specific information, she was told that Camilla had insisted on privacy for personal reasons and had given her security team the night off. This was unprecedented. Senior royals do not simply dismiss their protection teams, especially not for entire evenings. The security implications alone would never have been approved under normal circumstances. But Camilla had apparently asserted her authority as Queen Consort and insisted on being left alone. Anne obtained traffic camera footage from the route between London and Windsor. At 10:38 on the evening of November 15th, a vehicle registered to the royal household and frequently used by Camilla's staff was captured traveling from London toward Windsor. The same vehicle returned to London at 1:14 in the morning. The timing aligned perfectly with the security logs showing someone accessing Elizabeth's private apartments. Camilla had been at Windsor that night. She had entered her late mother-in-law's sealed rooms, and she had accessed a safe whose combination she should not have possessed. But how did Camilla get the combination? Anne was meticulous about security. She would never have shared that information, and Elizabeth certainly would not have given it to Camilla. The Queen had maintained strict boundaries about her private affairs, and Camilla had never been in the inner circle trusted with such sensitive information. Anne's investigation led her to a disturbing possibility. In the final weeks of Elizabeth's life, when the Queen was declining rapidly at Balmoral, there had been chaos in managing her affairs. Multiple family members had been present, emotions were high, and normal security protocols had been somewhat relaxed in deference to the Queen's comfort. During this period, Camilla had been at Balmoral as Charles's wife, supporting him through his mother's final days. She had been in and out of private spaces, privy to conversations about settling Elizabeth's affairs, present for discussions about what would happen after the Queen's death. Anne reviewed her own behavior during that terrible time and was horrified to realize that she had, on at least one occasion, opened Elizabeth's personal safe while others were in the room. She had been retrieving important documents related to funeral arrangements, not thinking about who might be watching, not imagining that anyone would note and remember the combination. Camilla had been in that room. Anne could picture it now, a moment she had forgotten in the overwhelming grief and logistical chaos of preparing for a state funeral. Camilla had been standing near the window, seemingly lost in her own thoughts, while Anne had opened the safe and removed papers Elizabeth had left regarding her final wishes. Camilla had watched. She had memorized the combination, and she had waited 2 years for the right moment to use that information for her own purposes. The calculation and patience required for such deception was chilling. Anne confronted Camilla's personal secretary, a woman who had worked for the Queen Consort for over 15 years. Under pressure, the secretary admitted that Camilla had asked her to arrange private access to Windsor on the night of November 15th. She had been told it was for sentimental reasons, that Camilla wanted to spend time alone in spaces associated with the late Queen. The secretary had facilitated the visit, arranging the vehicle, ensuring security would be minimal, creating the conditions for Camilla to enter the private apartments undetected. She swore she had no knowledge of what Camilla actually did that night, believing it was simply a private moment of mourning. Whether the secretary was telling the truth or protecting her employer was impossible to determine, but it no longer mattered. Anne had established that Camilla had accessed the safe, had placed the damaging documents inside, and had done so through deception and violation of royal protocols. The remaining question was why? Why hide these documents in Elizabeth's safe rather than destroying them? Anne studied the contents again, looking for clues to Camilla's motivations. And slowly, a possibility emerged that was even more disturbing than simple concealment: the documents that change everything. As Anne examined the documents more carefully, patterns emerged that revealed the full scope of what Camilla had been hiding. These were not random papers gathered haphazardly, but a carefully curated collection, organized chronologically and by topic, as if assembled for a specific purpose. The earliest documents dated from 1986, the year Charles and Camilla's affair resumed in earnest. There were hotel receipts, credit card statements, and phone records showing frequent contact between Charles and Camilla during a period when both were married to other people. These records contradicted Charles's later claims that the affair only began after his marriage to Diana had irretrievably broken down. More damaging were letters between Camilla and her then-husband, Andrew Parker Bowles. These letters revealed that Andrew knew about the affair and had, in fact, facilitated it. He had agreed to provide cover for Camilla's absences, to maintain the fiction of their marriage, in exchange for financial considerations that were detailed in accompanying bank statements. The royal family had paid Andrew Parker Bowles substantial sums throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. The payments were disguised as consulting fees and honoraria for various ceremonial roles, but the amounts were far beyond what those positions would normally command. Andrew was being compensated for his silence and cooperation. There were also payments to journalists. Specific reporters at major newspapers and broadcasters had received money, funneled through intermediaries, to write favorable stories about Charles and Camilla while publishing damaging material about Diana. The media campaign that had portrayed Diana as unstable and difficult had not been organic but carefully orchestrated and paid for. Anne read transcripts of phone conversations that had been secretly recorded, conversations between Camilla and various confidants revealing her true opinions about Diana, about the royal family, about her own ambitions. In these private moments, Camilla was calculating and cold, discussing Diana as an obstacle to be managed rather than a human being in pain. One letter in particular made Anne's blood boil. Written in 1992, Camilla had detailed to a friend her strategy for outlasting Diana. She wrote about understanding that public sympathy was currently with the princess, but that this would change over time. She discussed the importance of being patient, of maintaining a low profile, of allowing Diana to self-destruct, while Camilla positioned herself as the stable, mature alternative. The strategy had worked. Diana had indeed self-destructed, driven to increasingly desperate acts by isolation and betrayal. Her behavior used as evidence that she was unsuitable to be queen. And Camilla had waited in the wings, biding her time, eventually achieving everything she had methodically planned. There were documents related to Diana's death in 1997. Nothing suggesting foul play or conspiracy, but evidence of how quickly Charles and his circle had moved to control the narrative. Within days of Diana's funeral, plans were already being made to rehabilitate Camilla's image, to gradually reintroduce her to public life, to begin the long campaign that would eventually make her acceptable as Charles's wife. Anne found correspondence between Camilla and various public relations firms, detailed strategies for managing public opinion, polling data about what approaches would be most effective in changing attitudes toward her. The transformation of Camilla from reviled mistress to respected queen consort had not been organic, but the result of a sophisticated, expensive, multi-year propaganda campaign. Financial records showed the true cost of this campaign. Millions of pounds had been spent over 2 decades, money that came from Charles's income as Prince of Wales through the Duchy of Cornwall. Public funds and assets had been used to rehabilitate Camilla's reputation, to essentially buy her way into public acceptance. There were also more recent documents from the last few years that revealed ongoing deceptions. Camilla had maintained relationships with certain media figures, feeding them stories, shaping coverage of royal family events. She had been instrumental in negative stories about Harry and Meghan, seeing them as threats to her own position and working to undermine them. Anne discovered evidence that Camilla had actively worked against Catherine, Princess of Wales, viewing her popularity as problematic. There were communications showing Camilla had tried to limit Catherine's public profile, had opposed certain initiatives Catherine wanted to pursue, had complained to Charles that his daughter-in-law was receiving too much positive attention. Perhaps most disturbing were documents suggesting Camilla had discussed with confidants what would happen when Charles died. She had consulted lawyers about whether she could retain her title and position as Queen Dowager. She had made financial arrangements to secure her wealth regardless of what William might decide about her role in his reign. She was already planning for a future where she would need to protect herself from potential retaliation. This was why the documents existed. They were Camilla's insurance policy. If the royal family ever moved against her, if William as king tried to strip her of titles or position, if there was an attempt to write her out of history, these documents could be released. They would destroy the monarchy, but they would also protect Camilla by making her downfall mutually assured destruction. Camilla had hidden them in Elizabeth's safe because it was the last place anyone would look. The documents could not be in Camilla's own possession, where they might be discovered during a routine security check or by staff. They could not be in a bank vault, where legal processes might eventually uncover them. They needed to be somewhere secure but unexpected, somewhere they could remain hidden until needed. Elizabeth's safe was perfect. It would eventually be opened and inventoried, but likely not for years. By the time anyone discovered the documents, Camilla would have had time to establish herself even more firmly. And if they were discovered earlier, as had now happened, they would still serve their purpose as leverage. Anne realized with growing horror that her mother's safe had been chosen deliberately. Elizabeth could not be harmed by this revelation. She was beyond the reach of scandal, but the Queen had represented duty, honor, and integrity. Violating her private space with evidence of such calculated deception was an act of profound disrespect. The final document in the collection was a letter addressed to no one, dated just 3 weeks ago, presumably placed in the envelope with everything else. In this letter, Camilla laid out her justification for everything she had done. She wrote about loving Charles, about deserving happiness after years of sacrifice, about the unfairness of being vilified for following her heart. But the letter also contained a threat. If anyone attempted to use these documents against her, if her position was threatened, if she faced public humiliation, she was prepared to release additional information that would be even more damaging. She hinted at secrets involving other members of the royal family, scandals that had been covered up, actions that would shock the public. Camilla had not just hidden evidence of her own deceptions. She had created a weapon that could destroy the entire institution if anyone dared to move against her. And she had hidden it in the safe of a woman who had dedicated her entire life to protecting that institution. Anne's fury unleashed. Princess Anne had spent 7 decades controlling her emotions, subordinating personal feelings to duty, maintaining the stoic dignity expected of a senior royal. But the discovery in her mother's safe shattered that lifetime of restraint. For one of the few times in her life, Anne allowed herself to feel and express pure, unfiltered rage. Her first call was to her brother. She reached King Charles at Clarence House, interrupting what was described as a private evening. Anne's voice, usually measured and controlled, was shaking with fury as she told Charles she needed to see him immediately. This was not a request, it was a demand. Charles, dealing with his own marital crisis and exhausted from weeks of stress, tried to put Anne off until morning. That was a mistake. Anne informed her brother that she had discovered documents hidden in their mother's safe by his wife. Documents that revealed decades of lies and manipulation. She would be at Clarence House within the hour, and Charles would make himself available. The meeting that followed was, by all accounts, explosive. Staff at Clarence House reported hearing raised voices from the king's private study, something unprecedented in their experience. Anne, who had always been respectful of Charles's position even when disagreeing with his choices, unleashed decades of suppressed frustration and anger. She presented the documents systematically, forcing Charles to confront each piece of evidence. The payments to Andrew Parker Bowles, the bribes to journalists, the recorded conversations revealing Camilla's true character, the strategic planning of Diana's replacement, the ongoing manipulation of media coverage, the threats implied in Camilla's final letter. Charles's response was initially defensive. He tried to explain, to contextualize, to suggest Anne was misinterpreting what she had found. But as Anne read aloud from Camilla's own letters that revealed calculation and cold manipulation, Charles's defenses crumbled. The king was forced to confront the possibility that his great love story, the relationship he had sacrificed so much to preserve, might have been based on a foundation far more cynical than he wanted to believe. Had Camilla truly loved him, or had she been pursuing a crown with ruthless determination? The documents suggested the latter, and Charles could not fully refute them. Anne was merciless in her assessment. She pointed out that Charles had allowed himself to be manipulated, had used his position and resources to serve Camilla's ambitions, had betrayed Diana far more comprehensively than he had ever admitted. The affair was bad enough, but the systematic campaign to destroy Diana while elevating Camilla was unforgivable. Charles attempted to argue that Diana had made her own choices, that the marriage would have failed regardless of Camilla's involvement. Anne cut him off with withering contempt. Diana had been a teenager thrust into an impossible situation, married to a man who loved someone else, isolated within a hostile institution. Whatever mistakes Diana made were reactions to betrayals far worse. The conversation then turned to Elizabeth. Anne demanded to know if Charles had any idea that Camilla had violated their mother's safe. Charles swore he knew nothing about it, appearing genuinely shocked by this revelation. But Anne was not satisfied. Had Charles known about the documents themselves, even if he did not know where they were hidden? Charles admitted that Camilla had mentioned keeping records, insurance against possible future problems. He had not pressed for details, preferring not to know specifics. This willful ignorance infuriated Anne further. Charles had allowed his wife to create weapons that could destroy the monarchy, and he had chosen not to examine what she was doing. Anne then presented her brother with an ultimatum. Either Charles dealt with this situation decisively, holding Camilla accountable and recovering any other damaging materials she might have hidden, or Anne would take the documents public herself. She would not participate in another cover-up. She would not protect Camilla at the expense of truth and honor. Charles was trapped. If the documents became public, the monarchy would face a crisis potentially greater than any since the abdication of Edward VIII. The revelation that Charles and Camilla had orchestrated campaigns against Diana, had bribed journalists and paid off inconvenient husbands, would destroy whatever credibility they retained. But confronting Camilla directly also posed enormous risks. She had threatened to release even more damaging information if attacked. Charles did not know what other secrets she possessed or what damage she could inflict. He was hostage to his wife's hidden arsenal of royal scandals. Anne had no sympathy for Charles's dilemma. He had created this situation through his weakness and self-indulgence. Now he needed to fix it regardless of personal cost. If that meant ending his marriage, stripping Camilla of her titles, even facing public humiliation, so be it. The institution mattered more than any individual, including the king himself. The meeting ended with no resolution, but with clear lines drawn. Anne would give Charles 48 hours to develop a plan for addressing this crisis. If he failed to act, she would take matters into her own hands. She would release the documents to trusted journalists, provide evidence to back up every claim, and let the chips fall where they may. As Anne left Clarence's house, she encountered palace staff who quickly averted their eyes, uncomfortable witnesses to royal family dysfunction. Anne did not care. She had spent too long protecting the institution by hiding truth. If the monarchy could not survive honesty, perhaps it did not deserve to survive at all. The palace cover-up exposed. Word of Anne's discovery spread rapidly through the tight circles of senior palace officials. Within hours, emergency meetings were convened involving the king's private secretaries, the palace communications team, legal advisors, and security chiefs. Everyone recognized they were facing a crisis that could topple the monarchy. The palace's first instinct was containment and denial. Communications staff drafted statements dismissing Anne's claims as misunderstandings or exaggerations. Lawyers prepared to argue that the documents, even if authentic, had been taken out of context or misinterpreted. The palace machine geared up for what it did best, protecting the institution through carefully managed deception. But Anne had anticipated this response. She had copies of everything securely stored in multiple locations. She had already provided copies to her own lawyers with instructions that if anything happened to her, the documents should be released immediately. The palace could not simply make this problem disappear through their usual methods. More troubling for palace officials was Anne's moral authority. She was widely respected as the hardest-working, most dedicated member of the royal family. She had never sought attention or caused scandals. Her reputation for integrity was unimpeachable. If Princess Anne said these documents were authentic and damaging, people would believe her. King Charles called a meeting of his most trusted advisors to determine how to proceed. The consensus was grim. They could not contain this revelation indefinitely. Anne would not be silenced. The documents were too detailed and specific to be dismissed as forgeries. Something had to give. Charles's private secretary suggested offering Camilla as a sacrifice. She could be quietly separated from Charles, with the marital crisis already public knowledge providing cover for a permanent split. Camilla could lose her title and public role, while Charles could position himself as a victim of his wife's deceptions. But this strategy had significant problems. First, Camilla had threatened to release additional damaging information if attacked. Second, throwing Camilla to the wolves would make Charles look weak and manipulated, hardly the image a monarch needs to project. Third, it would invite questions about what Charles knew and when, potentially implicating him in the very deceptions being exposed. Legal advisors examined whether the documents could be seized or suppressed through court orders, but Anne's lawyers had anticipated this as well. They had already filed preliminary motions establishing the documents as evidence of potential crimes, including fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. Any attempt to suppress them would look like obstruction and would likely fail in court. The communications team explored whether they could get ahead of the story, releasing a controlled version of events that minimized damage. But the documents were too detailed and too damning. There was no way to spin systematic deception, bribery, and manipulation as anything other than what it was. William, Prince of Wales, was brought into these discussions despite efforts to shield him while his wife Catherine battled cancer. William's reaction was immediate and unambiguous. Whatever damage resulted, the truth had to come out. He would not build his future reign on continued lies and cover-ups. William's position created a new dynamic. If the heir to the throne was demanding honesty and accountability, resisting became much more difficult. William represented the future, and his moral clarity contrasted sharply with his father's compromised position. There were also practical considerations about William's eventual reign. If these documents remained hidden until after Charles's death, they would explode during William's time as king, causing even worse damage. Better to deal with this crisis now while Charles was king and could take responsibility than to leave it as a ticking time bomb for the next generation. Behind closed doors, palace officials began discussing scenarios that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. Could Charles abdicate, allowing William to become king and distance the institution from his father's scandals? Could Camilla be stripped of her titles through some legal mechanism? Could the documents be authenticated and released by the palace itself, with appropriate expressions of regret and promises of reform? Each option had significant problems. Abdication would make Charles look guilty and would set a dangerous precedent for monarchs stepping down under pressure. Stripping Camilla's titles would trigger her threatened release of additional information. Releasing the documents themselves would be admitting decades of institutional lying, destroying whatever public trust remained. Meanwhile, Camilla herself had been informed of Anne's discovery. Her reaction, according to those present, was remarkably calm. She had prepared for this possibility. She had known the documents might eventually be found. She had her own strategies for managing the fallout. Camilla's lawyers contacted Charles's legal team with a message. The Queen Consort was prepared to negotiate. In exchange for certain guarantees about her financial security and public treatment, she might be willing to step back from public life without releasing the additional damaging information she possessed. This opened a negotiation between Charles and Camilla that was bitter and painful. They were husband and wife, supposedly devoted partners, now treating each other as adversaries in a high-stakes standoff. Each conversation revealed how transactional their relationship had become, how far they had drifted from whatever love had originally united them. Anne refused to participate in these negotiations. She had said what needed to be said. Charles and Camilla could work out whatever arrangements they wanted, but the documents would still be released. The public deserved to know the truth about how they had been deceived and manipulated. Prince Harry, watching from California, received updates through back channels. He felt vindicated but also sad. Everything he had said about the institution, about the manipulation and lying, about the way truth was sacrificed to protect image, was being proven correct. But there was no satisfaction in being right about something so destructive. As December 10th moved toward evening, the palace was no closer to a solution. Anne's 48-hour ultimatum was ticking down. Charles was paralyzed by the impossibility of his position. Camilla was preparing for war, and the monarchy itself stood on the edge of a cliff, about to fall into an abyss of its own making. The monarchy's reckoning. By the evening of December 10th, 2025, the royal family faced a choice that would define its future. They could continue trying to hide truth and protect reputations, likely failing and causing even greater damage when the inevitable exposure came. Or they could embrace radical honesty, accept the consequences, and hope that transparency might salvage something from the wreckage. Prince William made the choice for them. In a private meeting with his father, William stated that he would publicly support Anne and call for full disclosure if Charles did not act. The heir to the throne would not be complicit in continued deception. If Charles wanted to preserve any possibility of a working relationship with his son and heir, he needed to do the right thing. Charles, faced with this ultimatum from William and the expiring deadline from Anne, finally accepted that there was no way out except through. He authorized the release of a statement acknowledging that documents had been discovered revealing troubling information about past conduct by himself and the Queen Consort. The statement, carefully worded by lawyers but fundamentally honest, admitted that Charles and Camilla had not been fully truthful about the timeline and nature of their relationship. It acknowledged that steps had been taken to manage public perception that were, in retrospect, inappropriate and wrong. It expressed profound regret for any harm caused, particularly to Diana's memory and to her sons. The statement also announced that Queen Consort Camilla would be stepping back from all public duties indefinitely. While stopping short of announcing separation or divorce, it made clear that Camilla would no longer represent the monarchy in any official capacity. Her titles would be retained, but rendered meaningless by her complete withdrawal from public life. Most significantly, the statement promised full transparency. The documents discovered by Princess Anne would be turned over to an independent review commission, which would examine the evidence and produce a public report. The royal family would cooperate fully with this investigation, regardless of what it revealed. The statement was released at 10:33 in the evening, too late for most traditional media, but perfect timing for social media. Within minutes, the news exploded across every platform. The royal family, so skilled at managing narratives and controlling information flow, had chosen radical transparency over continued concealment. Public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Shock, anger, vindication for those who had always suspected the official stories were false. Sympathy for Diana, whose suffering was now revealed to have been even worse than previously understood, and grudging respect for Princess Anne, who had forced this reckoning despite enormous pressure to stay silent. Camilla herself released no statement. She left Clarence House through a private exit in the early hours of December 10th, driven to an undisclosed location. Sources suggested she had gone to Ray Mill House, her private retreat, where she would wait out the storm she had created. King Charles addressed the nation the following day in a televised statement that showed him without makeup or preparation, looking exhausted and defeated, but determined to face what he had done. He spoke about mistakes, about allowing personal desires to override institutional responsibilities, about failing to protect people who deserved better. He did not excuse his actions or blame others. He accepted responsibility for the deceptions, the manipulations, the use of resources and position to serve personal agendas. He acknowledged that he had failed Diana, had failed his sons, had failed the public trust, and he committed to spending whatever time remained to him trying to make amends. Whether Charles would remain king was unclear. There were immediate calls for abdication from Republican groups and even some royal supporters who felt the revelations made his position untenable. Constitutional experts debated whether a monarch could be forced to abdicate or whether Parliament would need to intervene. William made clear he did not want his father to abdicate. The institution needed stability, not more chaos. If Charles stepped down under pressure, it would set a precedent that could haunt future monarchs. Better to let Charles face the consequences of his actions while remaining king, demonstrating that accountability did not require abdication. Princess Anne gave a brief interview to the BBC, her first major media appearance in years. She explained why she had felt compelled to expose what she had found, despite knowing the damage it would cause. The monarchy, she argued, could only survive if it was built on truth rather than lies. If exposure destroyed the institution, then it was already dead and needed to be acknowledged as such. Anne also spoke about her mother, about Elizabeth's dedication to duty and honor, about how violated Anne felt by Camilla's use of the Queen's safe for such purposes. She expressed hope that her mother, wherever she was, would understand why Anne had chosen disclosure over protection. The Independent Review Commission began its work immediately, staffed by historians, legal experts, and ethics specialists with no ties to the royal family. They would have access to all relevant documents, authority to interview anyone they chose, and a mandate to produce a comprehensive public report within 6 months. The Commission's work would undoubtedly reveal additional uncomfortable truths. Already, journalists were investigating the hints in Camilla's letter about other royal scandals. Every claim, every document, every revelation would be scrutinized and likely spawn additional investigations. The monarchy had entered uncharted territory. Never before had a British royal family engaged in this level of public accountability and transparency about past failures. The outcome was impossible to predict. Some believed radical honesty might actually strengthen the institution by showing it could face truth. Others were convinced this was the beginning of the end for the British crown. As December 10th became December 11th, Princess Anne returned to Windsor Castle and her mother's private study. She carefully returned the documents to the safe, now empty of secrets, but heavy with history. The portrait of King George VI looked down, and Anne wondered what her grandfather would think of what his family had become. Anne's discovery in Queen Elizabeth's safe has torn away the final veil hiding decades of royal deception. Camilla's carefully hidden documents have destroyed the fairy tale and exposed the calculated manipulation beneath. The monarchy faces its greatest crisis in modern history, and whether it survives will depend on whether truth can be stronger than the lies that built it.